Good evening, everybody. We finally made it, the inaugural episode of Unsolicited Advice. Now, given it's been such a long time coming, and I'm particularly excited, there was really only one option for who our first guest was going to be. So tonight, I'm introducing you to a good lawyer, a great teacher, and an even better friend. Please welcome Jack Ellis. A little bit about who you are and what you do.
If we're truly lawyers, I'm a nerd.
Wasn't very planned.
Who are you?
That's a big question, Zach.
Put this in a too hard basket. I swear a bit.
Why do you think everybody hates lawyers?
Lawyers out there, if you're listening,
There's no work-life balance.
But I have faith.
Please welcome Jack Ellis.
g'day.
So let's start generally, Jack. Would you mind telling everyone a little bit about who you are and what you do?
So the reason I'm on this podcast, I think, is because I'm a mediator. So I, for many years, ran family law mediations and stuff, and it's been, I think, 17 years now. I'm a lawyer by training, did my degree at UTS, and I also teach mediation at the College of Law at Macquarie Uni, and also the Australian Dispute Centre. So I'm a mediator and a mediation teacher, and in terms of my legal practice, my background's in employment law and family law.
Mm-hmm. Well, starting with mediation then, you were our first mediator on the show, and it's also a niche of law that isn't exceptionally well advertised, especially in law school at university. Would you mind actually explaining what the role of a mediator is?
Well, at its most simple, and I think this is often a misconceived sort of typecasting of what it is, it's somebody who helps people negotiate to avoid court, right? At its simplest thing, the idea is to try and bring people together, have a structured negotiation that settles the dispute before it proceeds to litigation. And the unfortunate reality about that is that a lot of people have a kind of misconception, and unfortunately these are often judges and King's Counsel and these sorts of people, where mediation is essentially a process where one person says what they want, the other person says what they want, and we meet somewhere in the middle. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now the truth is that if that was going to work, it would have already, right? They wouldn't have got to mediation. And so regardless of whether it's a family dispute or whether it's a commercial dispute, and commercial disputes are a classic because business is all meant to be about not about feelings, and it's meant to be about, you know, being sensible and about not about money and not about emotions and stuff. And you'll sort of be surrounded by, because they always bring all these barristers and things, you know, you'll be surrounded by barristers and lawyers. Everyone's looking, going, oh yeah, it's a pretty obvious settlement here, but it's not about the money. And so then suddenly these, you know, titans of industry who are meant to be all about the cold hard facts and everything are locked in this kind of emotional driven ego dispute about, well, you lied to me, or this was the deal that we didn't do, etc., etc. And so essentially what a mediator does is work with the clients, and sometimes their lawyers, to work out why they can't settle for the obvious solution, right? Because there's usually a kind of reasonable midway that all their lawyers can kind of see, you know, but they can't accept it, right? And generally speaking, when people are trapped in that sort of mode, it begins with the phrase, we used to be really close. Yeah, he was my best mate, you know, the neighbourhood dispute, or she was my wife, you know, and that there's this sort of flip that occurs where, you know, the parties still sort of crave a sort of intimate connection, but they can't do it in a positive way anymore. So they flip into this kind of negative intimacy where they kind of sustain that intimate connection by getting under each other's skin. And you wouldn't think it occurs in commercial disputes, but it does all the time, particularly workplace disputes, I would say almost always, and family disputes to some extent. But so essentially it's about coming to a dispute with a commitment to the belief that the solution to this problem resides within the clients. You're not there to dictate or tell people what to do. And then to try and help them see what this blockage is that's stopping them just doing it for themselves, and then kind of walking them through that difficult conversation that they need to have, so that then they can settle somewhere where they're both slightly unhappy. You know?
My first thought after that point you just made is it seems like it would require a lot of trust from the parties to allow you to enter such a vulnerable space between them and slowly and delicately disentangle that. How do you get parties to trust you while only sort of being with them in quite a short period of time?
Well, to some extent, that's something you can't teach. And one of the challenges about mediation as a science is that it's very hard to do research because all of the sessions are confidential. Confidentiality is enshrined in law around mediation, etc., and without prejudiced privilege and stuff like that, because people are often in court disputes. And so it's quite difficult to do research. But essentially all of the research that does exist, most of it comes out of Harvard in the US, basically says that everybody knows that some mediators are better than others, right? So what is it that a good mediator does that a bad mediator doesn't? And the research just says that ability to build trust and rapport quickly. And so, and I've worked in busy mediation centres and things where you can just see that some people have better settlement rates, whatever that means, than others. And you can just tell they have this ability to disarm, quickly, to cut through, and I suppose reality is that it's not a science, it's an art, and it's an art that you learn from your sense of self, your own life experience, etc. And I think this is why, for a lot of, for example, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who come up against the justice system, they enter a world where people can't, the people standing around them probably went to private schools, went to fancy universities, live in expensive places, and they just can't imagine really what your life experience is really like. And if you can't even kind of imagine someone's life and what they've been through and the challenges that they've had to overcome just to be standing in front of you, you can't build trust with them. And so best mediators that you meet are kind of worldly, and they've kind of lived a life themselves, and they have a sense of being able to connect in a compassionate way that people trust. And in terms of, the great sort of father of what you would call therapeutic engagement, that would be Carl Rogers out of the sort of 1950s and 1960s, who wrote essentially that unless you can come to an interaction with what he calls unconditional positive regard, meaning that whatever you have done, I can only imagine, based on all of your life experience, based on everything that has ever happened to you, that in that moment that choice made sense. And that based on all of your traumas and experiences and victimhood that you've suffered yourself, that choice made sense. And so I'm not here to condone it, but I need to come with a sense of positive regard that you're here now, your life story is part of that. And unless you can do that, as you said, people don't build trust and people don't settle in mediation. I suppose one important part that I left out for somebody who doesn't know the mediation process very well is that you conduct initial intakes with them individually. So you get an hour or so, typically an hour to an hour and a half, sometimes longer. And that's particularly important in family disputes, to build up that kind of narrative, because a lot of those disputes are really narrative around this is what our marriage means, this is what what a good childhood means, this is what it means to be a father, this is what it means to be a mother. And you need to be able to sit with those narratives before you kind of let the parties anywhere near each other.
I'm really intrigued by unconditional positive regard. I would love to explore that a little bit more anecdotally. I can imagine, especially in family law where things can be very emotional and things can be very dark, I can imagine you would have come across a lot of things where it was very difficult to exercise that. How have you managed to retain that quality when you are confronted with facts and people who have done things that you don't necessarily support?
Well, I mean, the obvious situation where it's most challenging is when you're working with men who use violence against women and children. And I would have worked with hundreds, probably thousands now, over 1,000 at least, of genuinely violent, terrifying men. And one thing that I have learned in, I would say, almost 100% of those cases, I would say pretty safely 100% of those cases, whenever I have been sitting across the table from a perpetrator, I've also been sitting across the table from a victim, in the sense that these guys were universally brutalised by their own fathers. They were universally brutalised by a stepfather or another male figure. And this dysfunctional version of masculinity is something that they've learnt from a position of victimhood. And one thing, again, say 99% of these men have in common is they don't want to become their own father. And they can feel it in them, and you can see them resisting that thought that they might be turning into their dad. And so that's a little ray of compassion, I suppose. We're going, this is somebody whose life has fallen apart almost by definition at this point, especially if they've been convicted or they've just got out of jail. And they're wanting to give their children something that they never had. And so even though you don't for a moment condone terrorising women and children, you try and understand where they're coming from, and they're never going to stop being that child's dad. And if there's a version of that relationship that can be safe and meaningful, then you need to bring a sense of compassion in order to facilitate a negotiation that leads to something lifelong that can help shape an image of a father, you know. And because there's actually another side to that as well, which you don't see, is that this thing that happens particularly with young boys, where they're cut off from their father, and so they sort of idolise them, and they become this absent sort of superhero. And so some version of a relationship, again, provided that it's safe, provided that it's meaningful, etc., can often be, more foundational for a child's real perception of their own life and their family. And so it's not always just, okay, you've done the wrong thing. The best thing is for a child never to see you, because it has longer term sort of narrative and familial implications. And look, some of your listeners might find that a controversial thing to say, and I just totally defer to the experiences that people have working with victims of family violence. I don't for a minute presume to know better than they do, but what I have seen is that in order for a young man to kind of know who he is and a young woman to know who she is, if there's a safe way to resume that relationship, however minimal, whatever, it's often puts them on a sort of more solid footing than if they end up with this sort of mythologized absent father. Yeah.
In a similar vein, is there any preconceptions you had about disputes, relationships, whether they be family or professional, that you had before you really became a mediator that have since changed through your experiences?
Well, I mean, it's a slightly complicated question to reflect on, but I'll try. In that, I think, well, what I've learnt that is different, as I said, is that for most people, even though they wouldn't acknowledge it themselves, and I alluded to it earlier, conflict is actually a quest for intimacy. And we don't ever think about it that way, right? We think about it, I never want to see this person again, but then I text them, you know, and then I'm thinking about them in my sleep and all that kind of thing, right? Yeah. You know, that's a very intimate place to let somebody in, you know? And so when you see people who've been locked in conflict for a long time, and particularly in families, you see it where they've probably been separated for a decade, they might even have remarried, they might even had other children, but they're still in this cycle of conflict, you know, this endless cycle of conflict. Essentially, what I've learned is that's a cycle of negative intimacy, where they still want that intimate connection, but they just can't do it in a positive way anymore, so they do it in a negative way. And I think that I kind of always, my misconception perhaps before I went into this work, was that conflict was about anger, and it was about, you know, hatred and all those sort of things. But actually, it's about love, you know, and it's about hurt, and it's about betrayal and all those things. And it's just a sort of flip side of love, but it's still a quest for intimacy, I think.
It sounds like the space where mediation operates is one that is a lot more approachable and a lot more capable of resolving a dispute properly and sustainably. But inevitably, as we've sort of touched on in this conversation, there are very few black and whites in this world. Everything is grey.
Mm-hmm.
When do you recognize, or how do you recognize that a dispute is not one that is built for mediation, and when it should take a more formal resolution path?
Well, there are statutory tests. So in the family law, like, it's essentially, the test is whether or not the party can meaningfully negotiate, right? Now, in a family context, that basically means, can a person say what they want to say, or are they too scared? Yeah, because that mediation is going to be over in a minute, and there might be retribution, there might be whatever, right? If they can't say meaningfully what they want to say because they're too scared, mediation is inappropriate. There are also contexts in which mediation is very common, but whereas traditional mediation is basically inappropriate already, which is, for example, the personal injury space, where you have a vulnerable person who's disabled or whatever, has been badly injured, against a sophisticated insurance company whose job is basically just to screw them down to the last dollar, and they're professional lawyers and negotiators, where actually if you just mediated that, where you put one person there and sort of got them talking, this person would be very vulnerable to being steamrolled. So, for example, personal injury is one of those spaces where you probably do need an advocate, in the room, in terms of that. And pretty much any context where there's collateral purpose. So if, for example, that the parties are really just trying to examine the weaknesses of each other's claim, they're not genuinely there to negotiate, and they're not, acting in good faith, then sometimes it's simply inappropriate. Yeah.
And I'm presuming that this would happen in that initial consultation space.
Yeah.
That's when you, as the mediator, are sort of undertaking that analysis.
Yeah.
Particularly in the first instance where there might be a sort of safety or a vulnerability concern about being able to sort of best articulate your needs and interests. I can imagine it's very rare for someone to openly tell you, the mediator, that. It would probably make your job very easy. But how do you identify those symptoms or those qualities that tell you that this person might not feel safe and supported in the mediation?
Well, yeah, to some extent, just by asking them, like if he was here, if she was here, etc. You can see when you ask those questions to extent. Oh no, I couldn't possibly raise that, and you sometimes get people to say, yeah, I could raise it, and then you get them to the mediation and they don't, right? And the main big issue, and so you'll call a private session and say, look, one of the main things you said you wanted to talk about. Oh, it's going so well, I don't want to rock the boat. That kind of thing. So there's a sort of nicer version of it, but I think, at the risk of answering a slightly different question,
Show's built for rabbit holes. You can do that.
One of the things that we've learned over the last, the Family Law Act, particularly in family law, the Family Law Act was amended in 2006 by the then government to require mediation prior to filing applications in parenting cases, right? And essentially, that was a child-focused legislative change, and world leading. There are very few other places that were doing it, Canada, some states in America, but we're a real world leader in family mediation in Australia and New Zealand as well. And essentially, if you look at the kind of developmental prognosis of children when it comes to conflict, children whose parents separate and then the conflict stops are not more likely to suffer developmental harm than children in intact families, right? And so that it's not divorce or separation in and of itself that is harmful to kids, it's the conflict, the exposure to conflict surrounding it. And if you look at the developmental kind of prognosis for children in terms of their emotional well-being through adolescence and adulthood, children of parents who separate and continue fighting have the worst developmental outcomes. And so the then government recognised that then that means the worst possible thing you can do for these children is send their parents to court. Because the minute that you put two people in a family court case, the first thing they do is draft affidavits, basically saying every nasty thing that they can think about each other. And I don't know about you or about your producer, but I suspect there are things that your intimate partners know about you, right, that you would not like to see in sworn evidence. Yeah. And the minute that happens, particularly if you have been married, you have had a child together and you've been, through those tough things, you can never unread it. You can never unhear what was said about you. And so pretty much that parental alliance is smashed at the minute that you file those affidavits. But now reflecting on the question you asked before about something I didn't understand when I started mediation, something that's relevant to this notion that it's really better for parents if they can try and resolve things than ending up in court, is that when I did my mediation training, we were basically taught family violence and mediation don't mix, because essentially what you're proposing to do on the face of it is to put a vulnerable woman in the room with her perpetrator to re-traumatise her. Yeah. And when I say her, I want to acknowledge that there are male victims of family violence, and it can be a very lonely place to be a male victim of female family violence, because there aren't men's refuges that you can go to, there aren't support services in the same way. And so there definitely are male victims of family violence, but overwhelmingly this is something that men do to women and to children. It's a patriarchal thing. And so when I first started in this field, I sort of came with that belief, in the sense of we shouldn't mediate when there's family violence. And then suddenly we began learning that there were layers to that. Because what you start to realise is that most family violence, to some extent, is rooted in male entitlement. Yeah, this idea that as a man, I have a right to control you. I have a right to tell you what to wear and what to do and all this sort of stuff because I own you. Yeah, I'm a man and you're a woman, right? And this sort of this yucky patriarchal stuff pervades a lot of the family violence and the sort of narratives and justifications around family violence. And so when I first started doing this work, right back when the Act was amended, we have an option of issuing a certificate to say we think it's inappropriate to mediate, relevant to your question. And we issued a lot of these certificates on the basis that there was family violence, it was reasonably severe, whatever, so you need to go away to a court so the court can wrap its protective arms around you, through this process. But I was working at the Parramatta Family Relationship Centre then, and because we were a responsible community sector organisation, a year later we rang everybody that we'd issue a certificate to and asked what happened. And I think the figure was 88% of them went nowhere. They never went to court. They just fell back into a sort of black hole of family violence. And so what we kind of began to learn was that actually mediation could be a fairly supportive space for women who are victims of family violence. And what we also learned was that if we look at what was occurring in that relationship through a patriarchal lens and say, all right, you're too vulnerable because of your victimhood through this patriarchal violence, you need to go off to court. The reality was for a lot of these women, if they did make it to court, a lot of those patriarchal dynamics were exacerbated, right? Meaning that their partner usually had greater access to financial resources. Coercive controlling males don't usually like their partners to work because they'll be surrounded by other adult men. So they're usually being isolated. They don't have money. The truth is, if you have been a victim of coercive controlling violence, you probably are mentally ill, in the sense that you probably are depressed, you probably are anxious. Because you're a woman, you've probably sought help for it, which means you might be taking medication. And then next minute, he just gets one of these yucky attack doggy lawyers who'll subpoena all of your counselling records, subpoena all of your prescription history to put you in a witness box and sort of go you as a way of demonstrating that you're emotionally unstable and therefore an unfit mother to care for your children. And so, in effect, what was happening in those early years was that people were coming to try and seek help, finding the strength to leave a coercive controlling relationship, stepping into the office where they were told they had to go compulsorily, and then being told, sorry, go away, you're too vulnerable. And so we, over the last, since 2006, so 20 years almost, have learnt that actually mediation can be a supportive environment for victims of family violence. And if we identify serious coercive dynamics, the first question should be, okay, if normal mediation is inappropriate, what can we do to make it more supportive? Can you bring your mum? Can you bring another support person? Can you bring a lawyer? Can we be in separate rooms? Can we be in separate rooms with support people and lawyers? Can we be, all these sorts of things before we get to, no, you have to go to court. Okay? Because once you're in court, it can, for a lot of families, just make things actually a lot worse.
It sounds like there has been a few healthy evolutions in the space of mediation. From your experience, is there anything that you would like to see incorporated more or anything changed?
Well, I would actually like it sort of completely mentally taken out of the legal space altogether. Right? Yeah, right. Like, I think one of the real problems that you see, and I train a lot of mediators, and a lot of mediators are lawyers who are looking to change their career or whatever, who have got this very baked in, very procedural view of the law. And this is something you may not know, Zach, but every judge is a total workaholic who resents being forced to retire at 70, and the minute that they turn 70, they all train to be mediators or become mediators. Maybe not all, let's just say 90%. And so I've trained a lot of judges as well. Yeah. And unfortunately, particularly judges, barristers who've worked in the law a lot, come with this very procedural approach to the law. They think of it as a legal process. But as I explained, it's not really about the law, because if it was about just the legal process, there'd be some sensible compromise that they would have already reached, right? It's about something else, right? And so if you imagine, particularly an unrepresented person, in a family dispute, neighbourhood dispute, or workplace dispute, what happens to you is that you are freaking out. By the time you get into a mediation room, you've been up all night, your mum's been in you going, don't forget to say this, don't forget to say that, and everyone's going, don't forget to say this, and be nice, and you're just there and you haven't slept, and you've had like 5 coffees, and you're trying to remember what you're supposed to say and all that kind of stuff. And you're actually in a kind of fight or flight mode. You're in this sort of survival mode when you walk into a mediation room. And when you're in that mode, you can't really think, right? Your planning brain is just offline. You kind of just are in survival mode, right? And so if you walk into the room and you're in survival mode, and then the mediator sits down and says something like, I am the mediator, I will now take opening statements, and we'll do procedures, and we'll have this, blah, 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 blah. You stay in that mode. You stay in this frozen, terrified mode, where you then are kind of sometimes steamrolled along by lawyers and stuff like that. And you'll even get this thing with lawyers in the room saying, quick, we've got to get them to sign the agreement tonight. We've got to get it done. We've got to get the deed done now, because otherwise they'll change their mind tomorrow. It's like, wait a minute. Like, if we're all saying they're going to change their mind tomorrow, right, isn't this just duress? Isn't this just pressure, right, to get them to do something they're going to regret, and everyone in the room is saying they're going to regret? Because it's procedure, right? Whereas if you're in that mode and you haven't slept and you have all the coffees and your mum's in your ear and and you walk in, the mediator is sort of like, hey, you must be so stressed out. I can just totally imagine how scary this is. But, with a bit of luck, in 3.5 hours time, it'll be done, right? And there's a version of your life where at 2:30 p.m, this is going to be over. Right? And so hang in there. I'll do what I can to try and make it as calm and meaningful as possible. And I reckon there's a pretty good chance you'll get there. Right? Suddenly, you're starting to come down out of your survival brain. You're starting to think, well, maybe this is possible. Maybe this is. And so what you will notice, and any genuinely experienced good mediators have a very very settled mode of engagement. And some people might call that style, right? But it's not. It's technique. It's about bringing the client down out of their survival brain into their planning mind so they can actually think. And if you can do that, you get much, much higher settlement rates. And so, if I could change anything about mediation, I'd just take it out from the legalness of it all, and just put it more in this kind of sort of social human space, which is where it should be. because I'm not really sure how that procedure stuff serves anyone's interest. I mean, I receive letters from lawyers all the time, as you can imagine, and they're all these weirdly tangled syntactic formulations and things, and I'm just kind of like, who is this for? Like, it's like you're writing to me, right? Right? Why don't you say, we would like to do this? No. I refer to the above and confirm, and it's like, I don't know what it's about, but for some reason, there's this kind of formality baked into legal communication and legal style that doesn't seem to serve anyone's interest. No one, I mean, I look forward to watching your podcast or listening to your podcast. Someone explain what the point of all that is, because I mean, I'm a trained lawyer, masters of dispute resolution, been uni lecturer for a long time, practiced as a lawyer, practiced as a mediator for like 16, 17 years. I still don't get what it's all about.
I can imagine that piece of correspondence is so funny to receive when you're like, oh, my last message ended in cheers, mate.
Yeah, well, look, and I think there's, clarity and professionalism is all part of it, but this, you know what I mean. Like you would read it as a lawyer yourself. This strange third person and I confirm and this type stuff when you could just write yes, no, hello, goodbye. I don't know whose interest it serves. Yeah, so I would delegalize the whole thing, right? And I would just tell everyone to relax. And the minute you do that, you get much higher settlement rates. Yeah.
There was a point you mentioned earlier that I'd love to revisit. You said the qualities that make for a good mediator, often it is this worldly quality, well-traveled, whatever you might like to call it. I'd love to zoom in a little bit on your life and ask you, what are some key experiences that you had that you think were formative in you becoming a mediator?
Well, I'm not sure that they were formative in me becoming a mediator, but I'll tell a little bit of some of my experiences and give you a sense of the journey, I suppose. So my first love is music. So I'm a songwriter by instinct. And my first degree I did was in classical composition. So just up at the conservatorium here, I did a degree in composition. And then I got a scholarship to study composition in The Hague. And I was actually in The Hague when the Twin Towers came down. So when I remember it was the afternoon and I was riding my bike and there was all this hullabaloo and I sort of walked into this thing and everything was in Dutch and then these planes were crashing into buildings and stuff. And so the whole world kind of went into lockdown, and particularly because I was right in The Hague, living right next to the International Criminal Court and all that kind of stuff. And so I suppose that experience of being sort of tangled up a long way from home in conflict, I think, was something. But then I came back and I worked as an English language teacher. I travelled a lot as an English language teacher, lived in Phnom Penh, continued to play songs. I studied international relations. And then when I was living in Cambodia, I wrote my first novel. And so I wrote a novel, kind of started writing it as I was leaving and sort of wrote a big chunk of it in a sort of 9-hour layover in Kuala Lumpur airport. And then I sort of came back and I needed a job. And I was still an English language teacher, and so I was teaching English. But there was this emerging field of mediation. And so I actually did it that way around. So I did my master's in mediation first, and then I did my law degree afterwards. And it was as much a kind of desire to have a job that you could do flexibly, where you didn't really have to work for somebody else. You could choose your own hours and things, but you were helping. You were doing just one little stitch in a sort of fabric of peacemaking that has reverberations. And so it felt meaningful. And it's an art rather than a science, as I said, and there's an artistic quality to it that I liked. But that was the journey through music, writing, to mediation, and then law, in that order. Yeah.
I think a lot of our audience are people who are either studying law or at the early outset of their career. And law, in addition to any profession, there is this tendency when you're young to feel like you have to commit to something fully and work really hard and dedicate yourself to your vocation. And from what it sounds like, your career timeline has been one where it's been very varied and you've tried different things and you've been very flexible. Did you ever have that feeling when you were young that you needed to commit and you might have been missing out on an opportunity?
Well, yes, in the sense that I decided fairly early that I wanted to have children, and the minute you even contemplate, particularly living in somewhere as expensive as Sydney, the idea of bringing a child into the world, it sort of comes with this sense of, well, how am I going to provide for a child, and how am I going to put a roof over their head and all that sort of thing. So I feel that pressure absolutely. That said, I see a lot of people through my work at Macquarie particularly, and this is going to sound patronising, but I'm just going to say it, right, who just really don't realise how young they are, right, in the sense that when they're doing this thing of locking themselves in, thinking this is that I've got to lock in and do this sort of narrow pathway sort of thing, they're what, 24, 25, right? And they're probably going to have a working life of, 45 years from there, 40 years from there. And so if you sort of lock in 1 year earlier or 2 years earlier or 5 years earlier or whatever, you're still going to have a 40-year career or a 35-year career and whatever it is. It's just that there's a chance that you might actually find something that you like. And one of the sad realities I see for young law graduates who, I keep in touch with and run into, and people ask me for references and things, and I sort of check in on how they're going, is that they sort of pick something very early and then they do it for 5 years, whatever it might be, personal injury because they knew someone, or they just fell into a job, or that was they found it on LinkedIn, whatever, and it's personal injury or it's conveyancing or it's some particular thing. And then what happens is they get sort of 4 or 5 years into it and they go, actually, I never really wanted to do personal injury. I just sort of did it. I never really wanted to do conveyancing. I just sort of did it, or strata law or whatever it is. And you go, okay, I want to change. And then they go, oh, but I'm like a 5 years post-qualification experienced strata lawyer or personal injury lawyer now, and if I want to go and change something, I actually have to take a step down in pay. I kind of have to go back to being a first or second year kind of lawyer changing to another field. And I'm not sure I'm prepared to take that pay cut because I've just signed a mortgage on an expensive strata apartment in one of the new developments near the airport. And so I can't change. And then this person is now only 29, right? And they're locked into this path that they've already decided they don't like, but they can't see a way out because it would require them to take a pay cut for a couple of years. And so again, the risk of sounding patronising, I really wish that some of those young lawyers coming out sort of understood how long their career is likely to be, and that locking yourself in early to something that you don't really like is actually life-changing. And that by doing a few different things, taking a few different journeys, being brave enough, not getting into debt too early, all of that sort of stuff, so that you can actually find something that's meaningful, which may or may not even be in legal practice. I mean, for a lot of the great thing about a law degree is that even if you don't end up being a lawyer, it's a really fantastic thing to show to any employer because, and I'm saying this to anyone who's like, oh, what Jack's just said, like I shouldn't specialise. But the reality is with a law degree, even if you finish a law degree and decide you don't want to be a lawyer, is that the great thing a law degree does to any employer is it says, I'm smart and I stick at things. Right? And that's a wonderful quality in any employer in any field. And so, yes, I felt pressure to narrow down. Yes, I felt the weight of responsibility. Yes, I've had parents who are, older now and all that sort of stuff, and and watched their lives and their mortgages and all that kind of stuff, and known the pressure. But I also had a sense of how long the years ahead were. I mean, I'm 47 now, like talking as if I'm some sort of elder statesman. I've still got to work for another 20 years or something, right? and so, like, I'm not even halfway there. You know what I mean? And so, I think, that's the advice I would say is just make sure that you don't specialise too early. And the best thing you could do is volunteer at a community legal centre, because the great thing about community legal centres is that people just walk in, and you just do one night a week or however your centre organises as a volunteer solicitor, and you get one traffic offence, one immigration matter, one whatever, and you've just got some smart like supervising solicitor who will just guide you through it. You just gather the facts, and then they'll sort of, help you handle it if you don't know anything about criminal, drug possession or whatever somebody's walked in with. And then suddenly, within 3 months, you know what kind of law you like. And so volunteering is the best way to avoid the railroad to perdition. Yeah.
In a similar vein as well, it's often a lot easier to know what you're not than it is to know what you are.
Yeah.
And usually it's that process of elimination we use to find it. Are there any things that you had experience in, anything that you tried when you were younger that you felt viscerally, this is not me?
9 to 5 office work. Yeah, I mean, so to answer the question fairly, like, I mean, I've had office jobs, getting up 9 to 5, going and, working for the man every night and day or whatever. And that was the thing that that thing of getting to the end of the week, like the start of a week and getting to the end of the week and just going, like, what was all that about? I would prefer to have 5 different jobs, right? Monday through whatever. It ends up being a lot more work, right? You end up being very busy and you're trying to organize stuff. But each new day is almost like a new week. You know what I mean? It's like you're walking into a new workplace, you're walking into a new thing. And so I like variety in my week, and that's something that I definitely don't want. Look, and also I struggled with being a family lawyer. And I had a very unusual path to family law because I'd been a mediator prior to practicing family law. And so the thing is with mediation, what's the wonderful privilege about family mediation is that you hear both sides, right? But when you practice family law, you just hear one side, right? And so you're going, oh, really? That sounds terrible. Da, 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 da. And then next minute, they're racking up all these bills and you're trying to subpoena their, bank accounts to find out where their girlfriend's money was going and all this kind of stuff. And then you start to realize that maybe your client is the problem, And it takes a while for you see, because I'll see this happen with legally assisted mediations where the lawyer's actually twigging in the room that their client is the one that's actually been difficult in this situation. And because I was coming to family law with the knowledge of, like, I could almost just hear the other side because I was so used to it. I found it very hard to kind of play that role of muscle in a fight. And the best family lawyers, which there's some excellent ones out there, don't see themselves as that. They see themselves as peacemakers, as people who steer you through treacherous waters to the best possible thing and then settle the case fairly quickly, move on to a new client. But there are bad lawyers, family lawyers out there who kind of escalate disputes, and they, partly with the way they write, why we demand this, blah, 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 blah. Like, is washing still hanging on the line? What do you mean, like, I demand this? And you know what I mean? It's like you just throw a hand grenade into people who've got to stick together. Even if they're separated, they've still got to attend soccer. They've still got to attend the child's wedding one day. They've still got to attend the graduation, right? And then this lawyer starts lobbing these hand grenade letters into that relationship so that little girl, when she grows up, is sort of, on her wedding day, the main thing she's worried about is whether her parents are going to fight. And so, yeah, I find it hard to be a family lawyer. Yeah.
I guess back on the topic of family law, one thing I'd love to ask you is to zoom in a little bit. What has working in family law in this particularly difficult space taught you about your own relationship, whether that be as a husband or a father?
Well, apart from anything, and Alice and I have been together for 21 years now, so, and apart from anything, it's taught me that if you make that commitment to stay with someone, right, and if you say, to death do us part, and you both really mean it, right, then, and you really want that to happen, right, then one thing, as night follows day, that is absolutely sure, if that's going to break, if that's going to shatter or fracture, it's going to be, that fracturing is going to be precipitated by a stupid fight about something. And typically those are sort of ego, sometimes just tiredness, toothbrush squeezing, toothpaste stuff, this kind of like hair in the plug hole and this sort of type stuff, And I think that when you come to a relationship, what's the old saying? Beautiful old saying. I don't know where it comes from, but go into a marriage with your eyes wide open, and then spend the rest of your marriage with your eyes half closed. Which is that if you look for things to fight about, you'll find them. But when you zoom out in the big picture of this, am I in this loving, beautiful thing? We come home and we share food together, and we lie in the garden and occasionally sort of walk around shopping centres or something like that. And you sort of go, yeah, okay, well, there's a bit of hair in the plug hole, or there's the milk's not in the right place or whatever. I don't want to risk smashing up a lifetime of loving connection for a toothbrush that's been put in the wrong place or whatever. That actually you have to make an effort to restrain those snarling urges to start fights about small things, because those fights about small things are the cracks that start the big fissures in a relationship. So I suppose it's about acceptance and compassion and hoping that the other person affords you the same grace. Yeah.
So there's some very valuable advice for once you've found your partner. I'm curious, do you have any advice for any of our young listeners who are on the journey of trying to find their partner?
Beauty fades. Yeah.
You still look quite handsome, Jack.
Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. But what I mean by that is that, and I mean, I don't know how deeply you want me to go into the question, but essentially the layers of identity that make up a person change, right? That if it's wealth or whatever, it changes. Next minute there's a stock market crash and, whatever. If it's physical features, it changes. You age, things happen. Your health, you get sick. Things happen like that. And so if you enter a relationship on something that's to do with wealth or physique or that sort of stuff, even to some extent, the physical, intensity in your connection, all that, that's going to change, right? And if that was the bedrock upon which the relationship was built, it won't last. Mm-hmm. And so what I think, are looking for in a partner is friendship. That sense of, if I had to lay down on the grass with someone on a day when nothing's happening, share a sandwich or something and sort of talk about what's on TV, who would that person be? Yeah, because that's a big part of being, in a lifelong relationship. It's the doing things together daily, and I think really that friendship is the sort of highest virtue of humanity, really, and seeking that friendship connection above all, knowing that the rest will change. That's the one thing that'll still be there on that last day. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, Jack, I think it's about time I ask you the infamous question, why I've brought you here. Why do you think everybody hates lawyers?
Well, I think there's an easy answer, and I'll give you the easy and the hard answer. But the easy answer is that they encounter lawyers when they're already in crisis, that there are things going wrong, and then somebody comes in like a dentist to pull out the rotten tooth or whatever, and so nobody likes that person because they only encounter them when they're in crisis. Mm-hmm. That's the easy answer. I think the true answer is that there are a lot of lawyers who prey on vulnerable people. Mm-hmm. And as I said, people, for example, in a situation, in a family dispute, all right, I need some help, I'm separating from my partner, what should I do? We're going to send an angry hand grenade into this thing and just make everything worse. And then as we make everything worse, we're going to bill you in 6-minute increments, etc., etc. Mm-hmm. And we're going to make him pay for that, without explaining that making him pay is just taking it out of your joint bank account, because that's where all the money comes from, right? And particularly in family disputes, we're going to do this and do this to him, but you kind of they leave out the bit that means it's coming out of your account as well, right? And I think at its heart, one of the problems with lawyering in the way that it is as I used the phrase before, some lawyers see themselves as muscle in a fight, right? And that actually a lot of lawyers, in the interests of sort of intimidating or whatever, make things worse. And I think there are a lot of people out there who basically say, I wish I had never walked into that office. I wish I had never done that, because all it did was escalate conflict. And the most insidious version of this, and unfortunately you see this a lot, is people who say, oh no, don't settle, don't settle. Like, we're going to get heaps more than that in court. We're going to smash them in court. No, no, don't settle, no. And, $100,000, $200,000 later, 2 years later. And then, the sort of day before the hearing, or 3 days before the hearing, we advise that litigation is inherently uncertain and there are risks that, can't be predicted, so we advise you should settle. Right? And all of those settlements that occur on the, courthouse steps are largely because of irresponsible lawyering that ends up costing people hundreds of thousands of dollars. Look, the reality is that for all those disputes that resolve on the courthouse steps, the vast majority of them are only there, and that's only happening because of irresponsible lawyering in the first place, which escalated a dispute that should have settled 18 months ago. And I think a lot of people see that, but unfortunately you see it in retrospect. And you say, oh, well, but for those lawyers, we would have sorted this out. And so there are good lawyers out there, and there are lawyers who see themselves as peacemakers, but there are lawyers who watch a lot of television and people in tight suits and things who regard themselves as sort of muscle in a fight, but they don't have the kind of courage of their own convictions to just advise the parties to do what they think will get it done. And instead they escalate, assuming that intimidation is going to work, and it rarely does. Because the minute you steamroll, people start pushing back and steamrolling, and suddenly you've got this fight that didn't need to happen. And I don't know if this is for the B-roll or not, but one thing that I'll tell you the thing that irritates me most about lawyers. Right, I'll tell you right now the thing that
You can point to the camera.
I'll tell you the thing that irritates me most about lawyers, right, is that they'll say things they won't put in writing. And right? So lawyers out there, if you're listening, right, they'll say stuff, and then if you want, but you try to get them to put in writing and they won't, right? So the minute, right, all you lawyers out there who are thinking, all right, I'm going to say stuff, but I'm not going to put it in writing, right? What everyone should hear from now on is that either you are someone who is totally prepared to perjure themselves, right, in protection of their own self-interest, right, or you're a liar, right? Because if you said it, why won't you write it down, right? Why not, right? Because you've just admitted that you're someone who will shamelessly perjure themselves, right, to protect their own self-interest, or you're aware that you're totally incompetent, and that's why you're not going to put negligent legal advice in writing, because you know that it's wrong. That's the thing that irritates me about lawyers more than anything else. And it's just a sort of seems to be a common practice, which is like, if you want this in writing, you've got to pay me thousands of dollars, whatever. I'll say it to you, but like to put it in writing, I'm going to bill you because I'm a lawyer. Yeah. So that's, the thing that upsets me about lawyers the most.
So I guess while we've still got you, is there any sort of last and final advice you'd give to our law students or young professionals to not become that kind of lawyer?
Let down all the formality and stuff. Put yourself in your client's shoes. I think is do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Right? If I was walking in this and I've been injured, if I was walking in this, I've been in a motor vehicle accident, if I was walking in this, I've been in a family dispute, right? What would I want my lawyer to do? And the answer is pretty simple, right? I'd want my lawyer to tell me in a ballpark way what my legal situation is. If you went to court, this is where you'd probably end up, right? Now, and this is how much I'll charge you to make that all happen, and this is how long it will take, right? Now, Go away and try and sort this out yourself. Now that you know all of that, try and sort this out in that ballpark, right? If that doesn't work, go to mediation, right? And if that doesn't work, come back and I'll run the claim for you. You know, and if you're that sort of a lawyer, honestly, right, you get a lot of clients, right? And I see lawyers like this who have matters that turn over quickly. They get a lot of referrals and stuff. Unlike those lawyers that you see, particularly at children's birthday parties and things like that, and they've often got a stack of business cards or whatever. They're going, oh yeah, I run a personal injury business or whatever it is. Da, 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 da. Why are they handing out business cards at a picnic, right? Because no one ever refers to them, right? And so if you want to get referrals, do the right things by your clients and do what you'd want them to do for you.
Jack, pleasure as always. Really grateful for you coming on today. I think producer Patty enjoyed the conversation. I certainly did. And
Thanks,
I hope
Patty.
everyone listening did as well.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, and thanks, Zach.
Beautiful. Jack, unreal. That was fun.
Oh, good.
I